The issue that we had in the contract that we came to a stalemate on was, you being able to be fired at will, but you not being able to quit at will.
I'm saying, no. I know the field. Your contract, ICE contract, any other contract that I've ever done in this is not in the mold of an entertainment contract. So any pushback from that is me or my company being taken advantage of or being left in a vulnerable place.
Does Ish hold resentment of Joe Budden because he feels underpaid? Well, I think we need to look back at this episode, Kingmaker Part 2. Many think that you can't look back when trying to look forward, but I think the controversy that arose out of the contract negotiations between Ish and Joe is why Ish has been withdrawn or dejected. See, many people believe now that the reason that Ish has an issue and is always quiet and acting like a child on the podcast is because of the arrival of Mark Lamont Hill. While I do think that's a part of it, I also think that Ish holds a resentment because he doesn't feel properly valued by Joe Budden. And there's a couple of episodes that show that. First, there's the Hakuna Matata episode where they argue about their contracts, which I think Ish severely beat Joe Budden. But there was an episode a few weeks later where Joe Budden and Ish would argue again about their contract. And throughout that argument, there was a series of issues raised that revealed insights into the business structure of the Joe Budden podcast, which we will examine in this video. But first thing of note is that this is an example of Joe Budden bringing back an argument that he felt he lost. Like I said just recently, in the first debate Ish and Joe had about their contract, Ish was just way more clever, he had better points, and Joe Budden just looked completely outclassed by his friend, partner, business associate, whatever you want to call him. And that was as a result of what he said about Ish being entry level. But that conversation about entry level continues into this episode, with Joe Budden desperately trying to clarify that when he said entry level, he referred to lack of experience. Things like, the way Ish treated the Sean Garrett interview. I think that's what he was referring to. Also, his moodiness, the way he could not adjust to feedback. There's also other instances of Ish and Ice being entry level. For one, there was the Brittany Renner interview. Remember when Brittany Renner joined the podcast and Ice was super quiet because he felt like she was clout chasing? That was entry level behavior. If he was professional, he would have dealt with that like it was his job. Anytime you go to a job, you can't just insert your personal feelings, or at least if you do, you have to hide it. Now, I only brought that up because so many people wonder why Joe characterized Ish and Ice as entry level. Well, to me, that was an example of the two being entry level. But Ian Dunlop says something interesting to me. He was present this episode as well, and you can see the early signs of why Ian Dunlop would fail to integrate into this show. One being is that he brought up how there's podcasters who've been working in the industry for 7 years and don't move the needle. When asked to name some, he doesn't name any. He just starts huffing and puffing.
There are people who got 5-6 years worth of experience in podcasting, and they can't move the needle. I can name some. This is Ian Dunlap, Red Panda Rebellion.
Give us an example using names of people we know.
And it revealed that, Ian doesn't want to ruffle any feathers. And this is why he didn't work on the Joe Budden podcast, at least for now. The conversation then pivots into industry standard pay for podcasters. Joe says Ish and Ice are paid more than podcasters. He claims podcasters lack industry knowledge, and Ish fires back by saying there's no clear upward path in the Joe Budden podcast. Now, I kind of wonder about this. Is Joe insinuating that they are paid very well or just paid better than most? Because Ish to me signifies with his actions that he feels severely underpaid. And the way he's acted since these contract negotiations, to me, very much indicates that. After that, there's a discussion about lack of transparency. Ish argues that there's no visible pay structure, and Joe and Ian Dunlop push back, referencing online data. What they're saying is you can go online and look up sites like Indeed or Glassdoor or LinkedIn and see how much people get paid at Gimlet, Anchor, or iHeart. So that is something that Joe is trying to establish. You are saying there's no transparency, but if you really wanted to find out if you get paid properly, you could go online and get back to me. Then there's a disagreement on who works more. Now, this is core to the time of Ish and Ice's presence on the pod. Since they got on the pod, they've sought to establish that they work more than anybody in the industry. They record more. They do several episodes a week, sometimes recording for, 5-7 hours a day, twice a week. And Joe deconstructs that and says, well, how do I know you work more than other people?
We pod more than everybody on the planet.
Can't say that. You cannot say that. We do pod a lot, but
we pod more than most podcasts.
But you're battling for network productions that are on 5 days a week, and they're calling it a podcast.
Yeah.
So we can't say we outwork everybody. Yeah.
Look at the Breakfast Club. They work minimum 4 hours a day. They work all the time. There's the other podcasters who record 20 episodes and batch record. So this assertion that you guys work more than anybody is not necessarily true. But I also believe that Joe is hinting at preparation. Are these guys researching in their spare time? Are these guys doing the back-end work that most of these podcasters in the industry do? Also, Ice and Ish are allowed to work continuously on other projects, whereas other networks might have non-competes. Then Joe drops another big hammer. Joe declares himself a kingmaker.
I often play kingmaker. Kingmaker meaning, back to my point in our contract conversation, what I pay y'all and agree to pay y'all, there is no Gimlet or Anchor or anywhere else in the world that's even starting a conversation anywhere near any of that. When you come and do this, value rises.
Now, you might be wondering what he means by that. Well, Joe means that being on the Joe Budden podcast makes everyone more visible. He claims the JBP boosts careers and pays better than most other networks. And he says something that I thought was interesting. He says that when they were about to tour, remember that tour for the Joe Budden podcast where they had to cancel because nobody bought tickets? Joe said that he was going to pay Ish and Ice even though they aren't proven commodities on tour.
When it's tour time, that money that we was going to have to get on tour, y'all have never toured. Y'all have never been in front of a stage. You've never done a show. You've never done any. We don't know how any of this is about to go.
Now, this is really, really key insights into what Joe thinks of Ish and Ice. Yes, they're good on the pod, but I think deep down he knew there was a big issue taking these two dudes on tour. They haven't been able to rock a crowd. They haven't proven that. But in order to not ruffle any feathers, Joe was going to pay them, I presume, well. And I always say when podcasts go on tours, you have to watch the dynamics because tours can be the reason a podcast ends. Look at Joe Budden, Rory, and Mal. A lot of the issues they had were because they had to break up the tour money. Then you can look at someone like Bridget and Mandy. Their whole podcast imploded while they were on tour due to backstage issues.
The first major crack that made it clear this is probably not going to make it.
The tour.
Yeah.
Consoling our crying tour manager to be was not on my bingo card for what we were doing. Yeah, that really put some things in perspective for me. I will just say that the tour for me was very eye-opening. It was kind of a realization that in order for things to go smoothly, it was going to have to be her way or the highway.
Then you can even look at No Jumper, right? When No Jumper, the offshoots, AD, Figmunity, all those guys, they went on tour and they started competing with the No Jumper podcast tour, that caused issues as well. So touring causes a lot of drama. And if you can see, since then, the Joe Budden podcast hasn't went on tour. And I think it's because Joe knows that there is a lot of problems that could sprout off of a podcast tour. Then Ish gets into this talking point where he reiterates that there is no path to grow at the JBP. Joe then says growth must happen outside the show, like something similar that he said to Rory and Mal. Now, Ish is trying to treat the Joe Budden podcast like a regular job. Usually a regular job, they have an organizational structure where you can see if I do this, this, and that, then I get promoted. But at the Joe Budden podcast, Joe is trying to tell Ish, hey, the way you grow, the way you get paid more is if you gain bigger value outside of this podcast. If you go somewhere else and you launch a channel and it has 100,000 subscribers, you're doing 1 million views a week, then we have a different discussion. But right now, with what you contribute to the show, your growth is not necessarily reflected in the compensation you are trying to seek. Now, we are seeing a reconciliation of Ish's value to the show. Ish thinks he's worth something that Joe doesn't believe he is worth. And then we pivot to business and contracts. Joe discusses production expenses and says Ish is demanding more without market leverage. What he's saying here is that Ish is asking for a raise or better compensation, but yet he doesn't have any other people in the industry willing to offer him that money. There's no iHeart, there's no Jumper willing to pay Ish what he is demanding from Joe. And also, I think Joe is saying the other stipulation that Ish wants is protection from being fired is something that other industries won't give him, while other networks won't give him. Ish wants the ability to not be at will. For those of you that don't know, most people are employed via at will, where an employer can fire you at will whenever they see fit. And Joe is like, that is what's common in this industry, especially the industry of podcasting. But Ish sorely disagrees. Then there seems to be some miscommunication about the contract negotiations, with Joe saying that Ish agreed to partial terms without seeing the full deal.
But you assume the other terms will be agreed upon?
Yes.
That's a mistake.
So what happened is in this contract negotiation, Ish and Joe started to agree on certain things. Ish first agreed on how much he would get paid, but he didn't know about all the other stipulations that would come with that type of payment. And Ian Dunlop on the show says that was a big mistake by Ish to assume that all of the other things would fall into place, but Ish asserts that no, the whole negotiation was on the table. I largely agree, but in the room, Joe Budden kind of gaslights everyone into agreeing with him. Another big key point of this whole back and forth is the shadow that Rory and Mal cast.
I love you bringing up because those are two niggas that sat in my face the same way you sitting in my face and said, I have no aspiration to do anything in entertainment. I hate podcasting.
As it's pretty clear, Joe is still hurt by how Rory and Mal left, admitting that he is still dealing with the aftermath. For those of you that don't remember, after Rory and Mal left, Joe Budden was down bad. His views plummeted. He even had to take his content and put it on Facebook because I think the views were so bad that he wasn't getting the payout that he wanted to see, and the visibility metrics were all down. And Ian Dunlop then interjects and says Ish is protecting himself while Joe is protecting his business, but Ish shoots that down and says that he is protecting his business. That's that Ish Media.
He's talking from Joe Budden, the company, and you're talking from the person.
That's not true.
And I always go through that.
That's not true,
I always
though.
go through that.
I'm talking from that Ish Media Group.
Now, this is a key point because I don't know if at the time of this debate, if Ish had That's That Ish Media, but he would go on to file for that LLC. And let's see if he ever does something with that, because that was one of the core underpinnings of this argument was Ish saying that I will never start any type of content. So why are you trying to put in the contract that I can't start a podcast should I want to leave from the show? And Joe says, well, that's what Rory and Maul said. So that has to be in the contract. Then there's a discussion about control, loyalty, and value. Joe reiterates the Joe Budden podcast raises everyone's value. Ish disagrees, saying he's not a podcaster. And Ian suggests those who leave the JBP should get a cut of future profits. Essentially what happened to Bridget and Mandy when they left. They had to give Joe in perpetuity for the rest of their lives profits, percentages off of See the Thing Is. Then the final blow comes from Joe, and Joe says he doesn't understand the value that Ish is getting, and Corey steps in and takes Joe's side, and Ish calls him a yes man.
Stop, Corey. Stop.
That's true.
When Joe got a point, you be vocal. When I got a point, you don't say nothing. You sit there like a mime. When Joe got a point, you come to run and defend him. Don't do that.
That's right. Ish revealed kind of a lot. I think the whole cast outside of Joe believes that Corey is a yes man because he did step in and immediately took Joe's side. Now, this whole podcast, it exists on the Patreon. It's a fascinating discussion, and it's called episode Kingmaker 2. This was around the time when Joe, I believe, was trying to establish his Patreon, so he would release one part of a podcast and then release another part. So there was a Kingmaker 1 where not much happened, and then there was a Kingmaker 2 that he would release on the $25 tier. So you're seeing here kind of tact that he's using to grow his Patreon. Now, there's a lot more that happens this episode as you kind of see the machinations of a businessman against his own friend, because Ish and Joe would eventually figure things out. However, Joe would get some type of, support by bringing in Flip and Melissa Ford. And it's common knowledge from my research that Ish had no idea that Joe was bringing in Flip. He said that on a Reddit talk. Now, I want to fast forward to present day. This episode was a few years ago, but I brought it back because it is crucial to understand the dynamic of business at the Joe Budden podcast. Once this contract negotiation happens, Ish is a lot more up and down. He doesn't engage in arguments and he goes quiet for long periods of time. Also, I wonder how this whole negotiation took place. Is it possible that Ish was getting paid month to month and then said, hey, I need to get paid more for what I do here? And this is how that negotiation went. I don't think these guys sign yearly contracts. What I think happens is that they sign a deal and it's something like, oh, you're going to get paid $20,000 a month. And I believe what happened is Ish was getting paid something and then he said, I need to get paid this amount. So I think that's the negotiation that took place. But let me know what you think, listeners. Is my theory that Ish has withdrawn from the podcast because he feels undervalued, something you agree with? Or do you really think it's Mark Lamont Hill? I don't think that's the case. I don't think Ish is that petty. If it is Mark Lamont Hill, it is more so that, oh my God, I'm getting underpaid, and then you're bringing in Mark Lamont Hill to cook me and make clips. The other day, I saw a clip of Joe Budden's channel that said Ish doesn't believe black people deserve reparations or something like that. That is something that makes Ish look crazy. Now, Ish doesn't have creative control of the podcast, but I don't think Ish knew when he signed up he would be clipped up and made to look stupid by his friend. This is at the core of the issues between the two men. Friendship and business is mixing. And that is what led to one of the most diabolical statements ever said by Joe Budden. He calls Ish an ICE entry level. In some ways they are. Hell, in a lot of ways they are. Like what I mentioned before with the unprofessional behavior towards interviews, especially ICE in the Brittany Renner interview and Ish in the Sean Garrett episode, which I think Joe tried to wake up. But Ish wasn't really trying to hear. With that said, y'all, I'm back. I'm making more content. This was going to be a long video because I think it is crucial to understand the dynamic of Ish and Joe. I truly believe that if this Ish and Ice thing doesn't work out, let's say Ish leaves and he quits the show, Joe will probably never hire friends again. After this Imani hire, it's going to be interesting to watch if Joe brings in another friend to be a co-host full time. He signed Mark Lamont Hill, he signed Flip, he signed Melissa Ford, and though there is varying opinions about if all of those people are good for the show, one thing is certain is it led to more visibility, more eyeballs on the show. Ish and Ice have no digital footprint that led to more people watching. It was really Joe being paired up with them that made people feel like this show was listenable. That first year Ish and Ice got to the show, Joe was carrying them. I'm telling you, go look back. Joe was doing so much to help them. He would go on like 15-minute segments and would talk for a long time because Ish and Ice were quiet. They essentially became Rory and Mal, where they were quiet towards the back end of their contract. They started doing that from day one. Luckily, Ish had the gift of gab, so they were able to manage that rocky road. All right, y'all. Follow me on Instagram, The Stop TV. Follow me on Twitter, The Stop TV. Follow me on Patreon. This is Danny from The Stop. Peace.